Hi, welcome to Functions Part 2. So last time we kind of talked about what is a function, some built-in examples, and also an example of defining our own function, a basic one with one input parameter. And we learned how to call the function. Now we'll be talking about slightly more complex functions. So the first slightly more complex function that we will be testing is the a function with multiple parameters, meaning you have multiple things inside the parentheses. So you feed the function more pieces of information. That is what essentially it means. You define it in the exact same way. So let's just do the same thing, right? Let's do the same um, let's do the same function, except now we have two input parameters. So one is DNA, and the second is the number of sig figs or significant figures, and um, that's how we output the percentage that we get from the get AT content. And then, so as you can see in the previous function, we actually specify what how many sig figs we want to round it to, which is two, in our return statement. However, here we can adjust how many sig figs um, we want to return from our function um, when we call the function. So we have to specify what DNA strand we are performing the function on and how many sig figs we want to return it as. Um, so So we want to do the same thing. So I'm just going to copy the previous function here. And the way you define it, besides having multiple input parameters here, is the exact same. Um, so, and then now we want to return the same thing, right? We're trying to return the AT content, which calculated here is just the number of A's in a DNA sequence plus number of T's divided by the length. Um, and then after that, we want to round it to the number of sig figs. So here, instead of specifying the number of sig figs, we have the variable that is the input parameter. So we can feed it however many sig figs we want um, when we call the function. So this is our return statement. We return the AT content rounded at unspecified number of sig figs. So let's test this. This time, instead of typing the strand directly in the when we call the function the string, I'm just gonna define a string that's called test, and then which is just that DNA sequence, and then I'm just going to try it. We call it in the same way. First, you write the function name, then you give it the input parameters. So the first input parameter is test, which is essentially this DNA strand. So we perform get AT content on test, and then we want to output three significant figures, let's say. So what this will do is it gives us the first three digits after the zero. We can do the same thing except with four significant figures, for example. Then we should get four digits after the zero endpoint. So that is just how to use multiple parameters, and you can have more, of course. That does not matter. And the order in which you have the input parameters or the arguments, that's what they're called, um, are it does not matter. The order does not matter. So now that we talked about multiple input parameters, we need to talk about not having an input parameter. So you could just have a simple function. I'm just gonna do a very basic example, and we don't actually always need to. Um, we don't actually need an argument. So there's two ways we can do this. One, we can actually define what the specific thing we want to perform the action in inside the function, which I'll show you later. And the other is just directly returning like a value. So let's say we return a number here. Then when we print this, we would just get the value that's returned. So here it's basically here it's like not very useful obviously because you could have just printed 42 since you have to specify the specific thing you wanted to return, but it is something that you can do. That's all. That's why we are mentioning it. Um, and a more complex example would just be, let's say we want to do the AT content thing again. If we didn't want any input parameters, then we could just define the actual sequence within it, which kind of defeats the purpose of the function, which is to allow us to input any value into the function and outputting the corresponding output. But it is something that you can do. So you can just do the exact same thing as this function. So you have to change this since you don't have it. And we can return AT content because it's something that we define in the function. It's not something we have to input. So basically we just included the input what we wanted to perform the function on inside of the function, which kind of defeats the purpose, but it does work. So when you print this, it will just oh sorry when you print this, it will just perform get AT content on this specific string. So it kind of defeats the purpose of the function, but again, it is something that you can do. Um, Finally, we can have functions with default. So what that means is we can have one of the input parameters already be set to a specific value. And um, yeah, so this is something that you can do if you want. So using the same example, if we want so one way we did this earlier was we just included the specific value that we wanted to, specific value here, right? Um, However, you can also do it as an input parameter. So let me just demonstrate this. So DNA will still be a variable um, since that's not something we want to default. That's not the value we want to default. We want to default the sig fix variable, and we can just set it to like 2, for example. Um, and then this just makes it so that you don't have no matter what you input, the sig fix is always 2. So then this will be the exact same. So essentially, this is the same as just having a 2 here, except now you made it the 2 parameter. So you could just change this value here if you want to adjust the entire function, which is something you could do. Um, so yeah, this is how you um, set a default value inside the function.